Anyway, my name is Chuck O'Connor. I'm the Dean of the Hixson-Lied College of Fine and Performing Arts. I want to welcome you here to the Sheldon Museum of Art this afternoon and to introduce you to Roman Bělor. Roman Bělor was born into a musical family in Prague in 1958, but studied and graduated in economy and management at the Czech Technical University in Prague. Following his graduation in 1982, Bělor worked in the techno-economic sector. In 1990, he became orchestra manager of the Prague Symphony Orchestra and was the director of that institution from 1992 to 2001. He has been the director of the Prague Spring Festival since 2001 and has been the vice chairman of the Czech Association of Musical Festivals since 2002. The French Minister of Culture awarded Bělor the Chevalier and Officer of the Order of Arts and Letters in 1995 and in 2001, respectively. And as a member of various teams and panels, he has been instrumental in developing recent recognition of Prague as a European cultural capital. Bělor is also a member of the Council of the UNESCO International Fund for Promotion of Culture and a member of the Club of Old Prague and is an associate member of the Prague Fine Arts Society. Please welcome Roman Bělor. His talk is entitled Prague Spring Musical Festival. Roman.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor for me to be here, and I would like to express my gratitude and admiration for what James and Mariana and others have done to make this meeting possible, because it's really something like a dream to come to Nebraska and to find a place where people are so interested in the Czechs and in what the Czechs are doing. So I'll try to participate in extension of their interest. This week is dedicated to the Prague Spring 1968, and as you see on the screen, I would like to bring some sun or some optimism to discussion, because during the last days I'm afraid that the suicidal tendencies have grown, because the theme of 1968 is everything but a happy story. But I'm pleased to have a possibility to offer to you another Prague Spring that lasts much longer than 7 months, and Prague Spring that has existed already before Prague Spring 1968, and Prague Spring that has existed even before the communists came to the power in 1948. And so here we are, but I have a respect for the main theme of the conference or meeting, and so I will invite you to join me in the time machine, and we will jump immediately in the middle of events of 1968. We will jump into the 12th of May, 1968. make an unpolite stop Maestro Karel Ančel and the Czech Philharmonic would excuse my stop of this video, because I wanted to draw your attention to the sign on the wall of Smetana Hall. There's written Pražské jaro 1968. So it was probably the first time when Prague Spring 1968 has appeared, because political term 1968 or Prague Spring 1968 has appeared much later. That's the second stop. We are now in the middle of, or at the beginning of the opening concert of the Prague Spring Festival 1968, and it should be said that this was already 23rd year of the festival, and Maestro Karel Ančel, at the time music director of the Czech Philharmonic, like anybody in the hall, could have expected what would happen in, let's say, 3.5 months. So it was an opening concert of the festival, full of optimism, full of hopes, and let's think about what kind of atmosphere people have felt at the time. So I will give you just my impression. I was 10 years old at the time, and I remember very well the broad optimism through the society. And for myself, it was quite interesting, because my grandfather was a close friend of the founder of the Czech Boy Scouts movement, and Boy Scouts movement was banned by the communists after 1948, and I've got a chance to become a member of a Boy Scouts movement immediately in the beginning of 1968, and I have witnessed something unbelievable. It was such an immediate rebirth of Boy Scouts movement, and I was surprised by the fact that I simply didn't know from where all those structures have appeared. And you may know that the communists were unable to distribute the goods well. And in a small department store in the middle of Prague called Dětský dům, or Children's House, immediately there appeared one special floor dedicated to the Boy Scouts, and in a few weeks everything was available there. From backpacks until shoes, from shoes to the Boy Scouts hats, everything was there. So everybody who wanted to be a real Boy Scout had a chance to go there and buy everything. Everything was there. So it was for me a signature that something special is happening, and I have used it. And I remember the pride to go through the streets in the Boy Scouts uniform. But as Maestro Ančel didn't expect that he will have to emigrate in 1 year, and I didn't expect that Boy Scouts movement will be banned again in a year. We were very full of optimism. But I have said that Prague Spring Festival is much longer than Prague Spring 1968. Nevertheless, there is a question: what has happened before 1968 with the festival? What has happened with the musical life of Czechoslovakia? What was happening before? So let me please to go back in the history, and I will make a short historical survey to the musical life of Czech lands and Czechoslovakia. There is something what should be mentioned. Czech lands, it's a more exact term than Czech Republic, because Czech lands is a historical term describing the space, not just a national space. Have had in the past some special traits, and one of them is unbelievably rich musical heritage. it's somehow based in a very detailed structure of music development that started in the 17th and went on in the 18th century, when almost last village had a cantor who was teaching music, and it led to a special situation that was admired by neighbor nations, when even in the last village a carpenter or local servant or hunter was able to play trumpet or violin, and I'm afraid we cannot say this today, but at that time it was something what was not usual in other countries of Europe. So we were really a superpower in, let's say, folk music, or in a detailed distribution of musical knowledges throughout the country. So, and it led to the special situation nowadays that we may say that we are the smallest nation having the biggest musical heritage, and to be sincere, sometimes we have a problem that we don't have enough capacities, and we don't have enough high quality capacities to present all our musical heritage, and very often we have to ask other nations to help us. Just briefly, I will jump through the centuries and through the music styles, just to mention certain names that should be mentioned. So there are some important Czech composers from Renaissance period. We will jump to the Baroque period, and especially the name of Jan Dismas Zelenka should be underlined, because this was a person that was respected by his colleagues at the time, like Johann Sebastian Bach, Antonio Vivaldi, or Georg Friedrich Händel. So it was a great personality who has meant a lot. But as I said, we had too many people and not so much work, so many of our composers and musicians were forced to leave Czech lands to find better job, to be paid, and to find, let's say, economical background for their existence. So we were really what was called the Conservatoire of Europe. We were distributing our musicians worldwide, what was quite interesting, and this is also something what we most probably cannot offer to the other nations today. There are many important names. Josef Mysliveček was a big star on the top of his career in Italy. Family of Stamitz. Stamitz family has strongly influenced musical styles before arrival of Romanticism. So we may say they had an impact on Mozart, Haydn, and others, maybe more famous coming after them. There's another generation of classical period. I would like to underline the name of Antonín Rejcha, who was a professor at the Academy of Paris, and among his pupils we can find great names like Hector Berlioz. And we are coming to this great period of romantic and post-romantic music, this big triangle of stars of the Czech music, Bedřich Smetana, Leoš Janáček, and Antonín Dvořák. Especially Dvořák has become, I would say, global superstar of the classical music, but we are following from decade to decade the strengthening position of Janáček. Janáček is, I would say now, very close to the position of Dvořák, and maybe in future he will skip over Dvořák, because especially in operatic world, Janáček is a big star. But they were not alone. There are other great personalities that should be mentioned. We are so rich in great composers' personalities that we can afford to put many composers in the second or a third line, despite the fact that other nations would probably accept them as a number one or a number two. Very often I'm using as an example personality of Edward Elgar, a great British composer. But for me, Edward Elgar, being a Czech, would be in the second or maybe third line. I'm sorry if someone is from Britain here. So. And there are other great personalities of the 20th century. It's sad to mention that many of them were later on victims of Holocaust and tragedies of the Second World War. So I'm just jumping through the names, but their names and their faces should be mentioned. And there is one challenging question, whether we can consider Gustav Mahler and Erich Wolfgang Korngold as a Czech composers, because they were not Czechs, but they were Czech-born composers. Mahler was born in a small village 70 kilometers out of Prague, in a small village of Kaliště, not very far from Jihlava. He spent his young years in Jihlava, and it's obvious that he was strongly influenced by Czech military bands and Czech songs, what is sometimes heard in his symphonies. And Erich Wolfgang Korngold, who became later on in US emigration a big star of American movie soundtracks, was born in Brno, in Moravia. But having such a strong musical background, Czech lands were trying to found something what was very popular in Britain already at the end of the 19th century, to have its proper music festival. And it should be mentioned, what happens to other nations sometimes, that our first attempt failed. This is a facing page of the program of the first great Czech music festival. It was organized in 1904. Antonín Dvořák was its president. And, I'm sorry to mention that he died on the very same year later on. But this festival was expected to be number one, and everybody expected that next years we will have other festivals, but we had no other festivals later on. So this festival was the first one, and for a long time also the last one. And I'm now jumping over the years until the year 1946, when we succeeded finally to found a real and I would say long existing music festival. And it should be mentioned that there were two challenging inspirations to found a festival in Prague. One of them was the first anniversary of the end of the Second World War, which was undoubtedly a great reason to celebrate. And the other reason was the 50th anniversary of the foundation of the Czech Philharmonic Orchestra. Czech Philharmonic was founded in 1896, and Raphael Kubelik, who was a spiritus agens, or somebody who has organized this foundation of a festival, wanted to make Czech audience known that Czech Phil is celebrating its 50th anniversary. So 2 anniversaries have led to the foundation of the Prague Spring Festival. And you see the poster of the first year. The first year was somehow dedicated to the musicians from Allied countries, so from countries who have participated on the defeat of a Nazism, fascism, and Japanese imperialism. So the emphasis was put on Czech artists, Slovak artists, but there were many guests from Soviet Russia, from France, Britain, and other countries. Here you see the face of Raphael Kubelik, who was very young at that time. He was born in 1912, so in 1946 he was just 34 years old. So it's quite interesting to know how strong positions were offered to young people at that time, because very often we are now speaking about young musicians when they are 40 and when they are 45, but at that time it's obvious that big institutions were more courageous in engaging young people into the top position in artistic institutions. There's a photograph of President Edvard Beneš, who was a patron of the festival of its first year, and you can see him on the photograph with his wife Hanna and piano virtuoso Rudolf Jirkušný, who is considered to be also co-founder of the festival, because he spent the Second World War in emigration in the United States, and he has brought many inspirations, what I will mention later on. And there's a face that is closely connected with the foundation of the festival. So Leonard Bernstein, European debut has happened in the Prague Spring Festival in 1946. And it's very probable that Bernstein was invited on on the basis of recommendation by both Firkušný and Martinu, who were during the Second World War in States and who have followed the beginning of Bernstein's career. So Prague Spring Festival has one of its pride, this European debut of this famous, maybe the greatest personality of classical music of the second half of the 20th century, composer, pianist, and conductor. And just to see Firkušný and Martinu in the United States, this is a post-war photograph, but it's nice to see these two gentlemen who were both, I would say, forced by the destiny to spend almost all their life in emigration. And the arrival and stay of Bernstein in Prague is documented in the Library of Congress of the United States, and you can find some interesting telegrams, something that doesn't exist anymore. And it's nice to see messages from Lenny Bernstein saying, "Off to Prague, everything beautiful despite bad cold," for example, or "Arriving by Trans World Airlines Tuesday afternoon, Prague, marvelous success, love, Lenny." So that's it. And to see something real, documenting Bernstein as a conductor in Prague. There's a small part of a Czechoslovak film news, and it's a very low technical quality, but it's nice.
Americká hudba. Dirigent Bernstein zkouší Gershwinovou rapsodii modely.
It's interesting because the moderator has done a mistake because they have rehearsed something totally else. It was not Gershwin. And to see something interesting, I have chosen a photograph documenting arrival of Russian artists to the Prague Spring Festival in 1947. It should be again underlined that it was before the communists came to the power, so at the time they were really invited guests who came without weapons and other accessoires. And I love this photograph because just in the middle you can see with the hat in his hands Dmitry Shostakovich. On his right hand you can see on his left hand is a violinist David Oistrach, and some other famous personalities of Russian Soviet classical music. For lovers of the technique, you can see in the second plant a famous DC-3 plane, Dakota, that was so popular after the Second World War, and I think this was undoubtedly one piece from so-called Lend and Lease system supporting Soviet Union from the United States during the Second World War. So Russians are coming in a plane given to them by Americans. And here you can see a photograph of Jan Masaryk speaking to the members of the Czech Philharmonic at the beginning of the concert of the Prague Spring Festival, 1947. And now we are approaching to less optimistic themes. This is the facing page of the program. It was a last program of Kubelik at the Prague Spring, 1948, because this concert was organized already after the communist coup d'etat, and Kubelik has had already in his pocket an invitation for Edinburgh International Festival, and he decided to stay abroad in summer of 1948, and it was the beginning of his emigration that took 41 years of time. So there's a short description of what was happening after, and I tried to mention something what was interesting, because the fact that Kubelik emigrated and the fact that Bernstein decided to boycott the communist Czechoslovakia was known all the time. And I remember that, for example, my father was a great fan of Raphael Kubelik. My father was a singer of the classical music, and I remember many of his friends. And at the time, we had comments like, the best Czech orchestra is Radio Symphony Orchestra of Bavaria, because Kubelik was a music director there in emigration. So among professionals, Radio Symphony Orchestra of Bavaria was considered as the best Czech orchestra, thanks to the fact that Kubelik was conducting this orchestra for almost 20 years. And in fact, there's a lot of fantastic recordings of Czech music, Janáček, Dvořák, and other pieces by this fine orchestra with Kubelik. And until today, it could be considered as a real standard of how it should be done. And jumping over the time until 1990, I have to mention that the comeback of Kubelik and the comeback of both Kubelik and Bernstein was something of a high symbolic importance for everybody, and even cynics were moved when they came back. The tragic coup d'etat organized by communists with the support of Soviet Union led to the second emigration. The first emigration happened in 1938. So in 1948 we had a second emigration of important people. So I'm just choosing three of them. Pianist Rudolf Firkušný, whom I have already mentioned, Karel Husa, his composition was played yesterday night, and another composer that was successfully established in the United States and Canada, Oskar Moravec. And we are now jumping in the middle of 50s, or at the beginning of 50s, and there is a beginning of certain historical paradox. Of course, the programming of the festival was not totally, but partly really influenced by communist ideology. So here you can see Mstislav Rostropovich, famous Russian cellist, after his victory in a competition organized by the Prague Spring Festival, and as a victor, he was offered a special concert at the festival, and you can see him playing under the disgusting slogan with the Soviet Union forever, and under the two strange faces, the first communist president of Czechoslovakia, Klement Gottwald, and Russian dictator Josef Vissarionovich Stalin. The other personality that started his career in Prague, being sent to Prague, let's say on ideological basis, was great Russian pianist Sviatoslav Richter. And I'm speaking about paradoxes because almost all those people after years became enemies of the system, and many of them have become dissidents, and many of them emigrated. So it's a paradox of the history that those who were sent to Czechoslovakia as representatives of regime later on became regime's enemies, what was quite logical because those were people of a high human profile. It's interesting. Prague Spring has welcomed officially from the United States famous Paul Robson. I've chosen just some examples from 50s and 60s. Paul Robson was considered as a representative of oppressed people in the United States, and we have yesterday discussed with our colleagues that this strange position of jazz that was ideologically somehow, with a great simplification, considered as a music of oppressed part of American society was somehow tolerated by a communist system, but not always. I love this photograph because you can see this here, the famous cellist Mstislav Rostropovich as a pianist. And he's following on the piano his wife Galina Vishnevskaya, established Russian singer. And I love this photograph because it's a rarity to see this famous cellist as a pianist. And later on, many important artists came to the Prague Spring Festival. Almost everybody who had some meaning in a profession came to Prague Spring during following decades. Here you can see the face of Herbert Karajan at the beginning of the rehearsal at the Prague Smetana Hall in the early 60s. And you can see Zubin Mehta signing programs of the festival. And there's a small gallery of the guests. You can see again Karajan and Rostropovich, Bernstein, many important people, including Luciano Pavarotti and others. So I would say, to make it short, everybody who was important was at the festival. And I like this photograph because this photograph is on the line of time just following this opening film I have offered to you, because this is a visit of Karel Ančer as a music director at the concert that was organized by the festival with Claudio Abbado as a guest conductor of the Czech Philharmonic. So it's a rare photograph depicting meeting of Karel Ančer with young, at that time young, Claudio Abbado. And now we are back to the theme of the meeting. We are in a summer 1968. It's a famous photograph by Josef Koudelka. By the way, there is a great exhibition of Koudelka now in Prague in the Art Industrial Museum, the Museum of Decorative Arts. It's very interesting exhibition, and his photographs from 1968 are also there. This one is among the famous ones. On the very same day, on the 21st August 1968, there was something what has happened in London. On the very same day, by coincidence of circumstances, Rostropovich was playing Dvořák's cello concerto in Royal Albert Hall. There were rumors and protests in the hall, and it is said, and Rostropovich confirmed this, that it was one of the darkest moments of his life, because he, who was undoubtedly not an exponent of communist regime, was a target of protests of audiences in London. And it is said that he decided to give an encore, and dedicated this encore to Czechoslovakia, and he finished the concert in tears. And I put on the list of the photograph this official portrait of Karel Ančer, but this official portrait is no more portrait made by Czech Philharmonic. This portrait is made by Toronto Symphony Orchestra, because Ančer decided to leave the country after 1968, and he became the music director of the Toronto Symphony Orchestra. So, and that's the description of the beginning of the third emigration. And again, Czech musical life has lost many personalities. I have chosen, just as an example, an excellent Moravian composer, Jan Novák, who was not just a composer, he was one of the best connoisseurs of Latin language. He was, for a certain period, the president of International Society of connoisseurs of Latin language, and he was known and respected specialist in that great language. And we have lost almost a complete generation of conductors, but it's not so known, because Ančer left the country for Toronto, Zdeněk Mácal left for the United States, Martin Turnovský also spent certain part of his career in the United States and in different orchestras in Europe, and there were others, Mr. Starek and many other conductors. But life went on, and Prague Spring Festival was facing to the potential boycott. Many artists decided to boycott the festival in 1969, but this boycott was later on withdrawn because the artists have found out that they would boycott the audiences and not the communists. So they, later on this decision was withdrawn. And here you can see Herbert Karen. I like this photograph. It's a nice documentary. Herbert Karen entering the artist entrance of the Prague Rudolfinum Hall. And for fans of cars, it is also an important photograph because you can compare at the time a bit old-fashioned Skoda car with Rolls-Royce and Mercedes. This photograph is depicting a concert of a famous and legendary Smetana quartet, and the interest of audience was so high that the promoter decided to put a part of the audience on the stage, but it's quite unusual in the Rudolfinum Hall. And jumping again through the time, we are on the break of 1989 and 1990, and this photograph is capturing arrival of Rafael Kubelik, has come back to Prague airport. So this is the first photograph of legendary and famous comeback of Kubelik after 41 years. And to taste a bit atmosphere of time, I've again chosen a small part of TV recording. It's the end of Smetana's Má vlast, and you will see President Havel as a first starting standing ovations. Now we will see the faces of other famous conductors who have conducted the opening concert of the festival. Charles Makeras, for example, Czech conductor Libor Pešek, Václav Neumann, and again we are returning to Karel Ančel, 1968. Okay. And the other moving moment of the festival was the closing concert, 1990, because the other great personality that returned to the festival was Leonard Bernstein, and it is sad to say that his concert at the festival was his last European concert. So the fate is sometimes creating unbelievable stories. So the debut of the Bernstein in Europe was at the Prague Spring Festival, but also his last European concert was at the Prague Spring Festival 42 years later. So that's it. And now I would like to describe the period that lasts since 1990, because we have no more reasons to excuse ourselves for something. We don't have any obvious enemy, just ourselves. So I'm pleased to say that since 1990 we are responsible for ourselves, and I'm very happy that we can be here, because otherwise we wouldn't be here. And I would like to just show you some examples of the fact that we are doing our best to present interesting music, and sometimes it's not just, I'd say, serious music, it's not just a serious job, sometimes it's also a happy job, and we are sometimes making crazy things. But before that, I would like to mention one thing that's connected to Mstislav Rostropovich, because Rostropovich, who emigrated from Soviet Union, promised to come back to Czechoslovakia unless the last Soviet soldier would leave the country. And I love this letter because he's somehow confirming to Václav Havel that he would come if the Russian army would withdraw. And it happened. So there's a confirmation of his decision to come. And there is a facing page of the program that was really dedicated to the withdrawal of a Soviet army from Czechoslovakia. And this festival was organized by our festival, and it was in summer. So the festival orchestra was put together by musicians who decided not to leave Prague for holidays. So it has a funny title, Big Festival Orchestra. What is an orchestra that doesn't exist, in fact, but it was a special orchestra that was put together for this special occasion. And it was played on the 6th of July 1991, and Rostropovich was star of the program. It was conducted by Libor Pešek. There's a photograph of Rostropovich. This photograph is caught a bit later during his concert in Prague, but it's a nice portrait of Rostropovich as a cellist, not as a pianist. And there's Havel's letter appreciating the fact that Rostropovich kept the promise. And there's a photograph of Václav Havel and Mstislav Rostropovich at Municipal House in Smetana Hall in Prague. And since then we have done many things. We have had interesting guests at the concert. I found a photograph of a first lady, so I couldn't resist to put it on the list of photographs for today. And I have chosen also Anushka Shankar as a representative of a bit different music, and it has sense because her father, Ravi Shankar, who was a source of inspiration for George Harrison and many other artists. Ravi Shankar was a guest of the festival in 1958, so many years before Beatles started to exist. We had Herbie Hancock at the festival, what was nice meeting, a very big source of joy for us who love not just classical music. We had a series of concerts of MTT and SFS, what means Michael Tilson Thomas and San Francisco Symphony Orchestra. We love abbreviations. Very fine orchestra, very sympathetic conductor, very nice meetings. We have, as a gift, we have given to Michael Tilson Thomas one original copy of a program conducted by Bernstein in 1946, what was European premiere of Copland's Symphony No. 3. And he was very moved by that. So this is what should be mentioned. We had Wayne Shorter from the other music. We had a meeting with André Prévent, and we also had a football match between BBC Symphony Orchestra and Czech Radio Symphony Orchestra. It was very tough, I have to say, but I have to say that Czech Radio Symphony Orchestra team, you say soccer, you don't see football. You don't say football to this. The team of Czech Radio Symphony Orchestra was very hard, and they almost erased the team of BBC Symphony Orchestra from Earth's surface, I would say. It was 6-0 or something like that. And I like this photograph because it's photograph from the last festival, and there was a concert of Toronto Symphony Orchestra that was dedicated to the memory of Karel Ančerl, their music director and our great conductor, who spent the end of his life in emigration in Toronto. So it was quite moving concert, and it was a great meeting for us working for the festival and people from Toronto. There were still certain members of the orchestra having personal experience with Ančerl, and it was very nice and touching meeting. At the end, I would like to put your attention to the fact that the logo of the festival is quite interesting thing, and the festival itself is something interesting because it is an institution that simply doesn't exist. We are an excellent example of something what is called intellectual property. Prague Spring Festival is a trademark logo, and it's a history. It's nothing else. So we don't have houses, we don't have concert halls, we have nothing except old-fashioned computers, but we are taking care of quite interesting institution that is hanging in the air. And to make a self-promotion, I'm pleased to present a photograph of a great maestro, Daniel Barenboim, whom I have met in Prague. And last year we have we have made through one dream we had for years. This dream was to invite Vienna Philharmonic as one of the best world orchestras to play Má vlast by Smetana. The reason was not just the fact that this is an excellent orchestra. The reason was to overcome some heritage of the past, because Smetana was very often used and misused as a weapon against our neighbors. He was used as an argument during funny discussions concerning cultural differences between Czech lands and Germany, Czech lands and Austria. So it was for us such a symbolic victory over the past to have Vienna Philharmonic playing Smetana's Má vlast, and they came, and Barenboim was conducting the piece, and we have persuaded them for years. At the end, it finished by something what was unexpected, because Barenboim decided to have it as a main program of his last season, and he conducted the piece with the Vienna Philharmonic and his Abendstaatskapelle Berlin 13 times within Europe. So Má vlast was conducted by Barenboim not just in Prague and Vienna several times, but also in Linz, Munich, Paris, Berlin, and other cities. Last interesting thing is that a group of designers put together such a list of 100 most important design icons of the 20th century from Czechoslovakia or Czech lands, and we were given number 37 on the list. So it's great to see this logo as an example of a legendary design icons of Czech lands of the 20th century. And in fact, the logo of the festival is so good because it was done by a famous Czech painter, typograph and scenograph Mr. Musica. And he was a close friend of Kubelik, so this is another message from the past we have from Raphael Kubelik. And we are in a good society, because among those icons is this fantastic streamliner Tatra 77, extremely expensive and beautiful car. There is this beautiful Java Springer or Prague, 1946. I have one. And this convertible that was very popular at the beginning of 60s in my country. Yeah. So each lecture should finish by some message or some summary. So this could be the summary to be mentioned. And I believe that music is still so strong that it can overcome even the strange periods of modern history. Our modern history was quite complicated. Yesterday I was thinking about the fact that this year, and it should be mentioned, we are going to celebrate the centenary of independent state that was founded in 1918, and I tried to count the years of a full democracy, and I have a small problem, because if you count the First Republic, it's okay, so we have 20. And you can count the period after 1990, it's about 28, so we have 48 years, and we are missing some 2 years to be in the middle of the play, to be well balanced between dictatorships and democracy. And I tried to put a question whether we can count post-war period 1945 to 48 as a real democracy. I'm not sure, because it was already influenced by communist ideology. And 7 months of 1968 is also to be discussed whether it could be counted or not. So I decided to make some compromises. I will count those periods by 50%, and I got these 2 years. So with this mathematics, we have 50. So we are in a 50-50 position, and now it's a great challenge for us to make the balance the right way. Yeah. And at the end, I wanted to present this beautiful photograph of a great British harpsichord player and conductor, Trevor Pinnock, because on one harpsichord on the left side, you can see an inscription, Musica curat corpus et animam. And it would be nice end of my lecture. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much, and of course we have some 15 minutes left, and I'm ready to reply to your questions if you have. Please don't hesitate. Otherwise, I would give questions to myself, and it's very dangerous.
Okay. I sang the Stabat Mater twice in Washington with the National Symphony with Zdeněk Matzau conducting. And I was in San Francisco Symphony in 1968, I think, just after the march in, and Rostropovich played the Dvorak cello concerto. And according to a San Francisco Examiner writer, he had tears in his eyes at that time. And the first pianist I ever heard in my life live was Rudolf Firkushny. He was in Columbia, Missouri at the University of Missouri Fieldhouse. And I think that must have been about 1953 or 54. I've never forgotten any of those experiences.
Thank you very much. I have met both gentlemen, I mean Zdeněk Matzau and Firkushny. Firkushny, I didn't mention that Firkushny also was somebody who came back after 1990. He died in 1994, but I was a lucky guy because being orchestra manager of the Prague Symphony Orchestra, I have toured Britain with the orchestra, and we had Rudolf Firkushny as a solist of the tour in 1992, and it was one of the greatest experiences I had from this profession, because it was a real gentleman. It was really a gentleman from, I would say, from old school. But on the other hand, he was full of beautiful and gentle humor. And his memories were unbelievable, because he was a close friend of Bohuslav Martinu, but he was also a friend from school with young Bata, the inheritor of big Bata shoe company. So his stories were unbelievable. And he was a personal pupil of Leoš Janáček. So his memoirs were something like to read an encyclopedia. He was a very fine gentleman and excellent pianist. And Zdeněk Mácal came back to Prague. He was a permanent guest conductor of Prague Symphony Orchestra, and for a certain period he was also music director of the Czech Philharmonic after 1990. He has brought many interesting American programs. He was such a courageous person in choosing unorthodox programmings. So Zdeněk Mácal is also quite interesting person. He has withdrawn from conducting. He retired, but I have him in mind as somebody of a high courage as to the programs. Thank you.
I am the next person, I suppose. My name is Mila Sasková-Pierce, and I'm very interested in the Czech culture in the United States, and in fact I'm a student of it. But I wanted just to point out that actually we had a Dvořák who came to have a concert here in Omaha in 1886, if I am correct. He was invited by his childhood friend, Rosewater, who was founder of the Omaha Bee newspaper, and actually was from the Czech lands. But I have a question. There was a very famous Czech American family, the Kubelíks. Mm-hmm. They were violinists and on and on. Are they in any way related and or to Raphael Kubelík? Would you know?
Of course, Raphael Kubelík is a son of Jan Kubelík, the famous
That's right, so the grandson of the first one.
And Jan Kubelík was really a superstar of his time, because at the beginning of the 19th century he gave a concerts at the stadiums. I cannot imagine how they made it with amplification, but it is known and it is documented that he played to the audiences of 3,000-4,000 people. And he was very rich, by the way. So it's interesting that violinists could have been something like pop star of nowadays at that time. And he toured several times in the United States. Mm-hmm. So Raphael Kubelík is son of Jan Kubelík. This is a very strong family.
And then elder Jan Kubelík is the grandfather.
Yes.
Thank you,
yes,
thank
yes.
you.
I have a question, if I could ask you. I know that John Cage, the American avant-garde composer, was in Prague sometime, I think, in the 1960s, and I know this because he was a member of the Czech Mycological Society. He was a mushroomer, and
yes.
and was a card-carrying member of that club. But I wonder, was he ever at the Prague Spring Festival, or was that another occasion?
He was not at the Prague Spring Festival, but you are right. Undoubtedly, he visited Prague in the 60s. And this was most probably connected with the fact that I didn't mention among attempts to organize festivals that Prague hosted in the period of the First Republic festivals of International Society of Contemporary Music. And one of great successes of 60s was that after years the Friends of Contemporary Music succeeded to recreate this festival organized by this strong and famous international society in Prague in 1967. And I'm not sure, but I think the visit of Cage was somehow connected with this Congress and Festival of International Society of Contemporary Music in 1967. But this is something what was not so mentioned here, because we have concentrated on 7 months of 1968, but especially in culture, it was mentioned, but maybe not the emphasis put on that there were some very interesting things having happened before 1968 in the late 60s, and this International Society of Contemporary Music Congress or Festival in 67 is one of excellent examples what was possible in culture at the time, what was very important. And generally my opinion is that the year 68 was very important as a break in the communist period. I'm not very idealistic about 1968, especially I think that the leaders were very weak, and it was mentioned here, they were something what might be described as they were cowards, and General Svoboda was somebody who has helped a lot to communists to come to the power in 1948, so the expectations of nation were very high, given to the people who were not so, I'd say, of a high moral standard. But I always had an appreciation for courage of people, and what cannot be underestimated is this possibility to brief liberty for a certain time. I would describe the communist period as a concert. If you would describe it as a long concert, the first 20 years I would describe as a danse macabre, and the second part as a boring brass music. Yes, and in between we had a break. It was spring 1968.
Thank you for the talk. I have a question that maybe somewhat ties in with the question about John Cage. You really showed how kind of various fissures and how the regime kind of depleted the ranks of Czech musicians, and to some degree certain musicians wouldn't come to the festival. But it's also obvious the regime tried to keep the festival going as a kind of way of advertising itself. How restrictive was the regime's kind of choice of music and artists? Were they willing to kind of expect to allow certain kinds of experimentation and more avant-garde artists, or were they very kind of conservative in their approach to programming?
Of course, we don't have this problem since 1990, but it should be said it's true that the festival was misused as a showcase of the so-called socialist cultural policy, and there were certain waves corresponding to the waves of a liberty or oppression in Czechoslovakia. So we say the festival was somehow there was some indoctrination in the programming, not totally, but there were some concerts that were, let's say, concerts serving to the system in the early 50s and later on again in the early 70s during this, I would say, so-called normalization, what is funny word I like, as a lover of paradoxes. And so you are right. But for example, from the end of 50s until 1970, the program was very, very liberal, and everybody was invited from the world. There were no limits, and also the programs were not limited as to the Czech participation. I mean, artists from Czech Republic, and some programs were very courageous, and in the 60s many composers and musicians who were limited before were given their chance in the frame of the festival. And it was the same later on in 70s and 80s, because the ices started to melt. So in 70s it was quite tough, but from the beginning of 80s the situation started to change. But paradox is that this had an influence on Czech artists, or Czech and Slovak artists, more than on foreign artists, because foreign artists were simply invited as a part of the fact that we are free. But it was, of course, very, very relative.
Would you say that interest in Czech classical music in Prague is decreasing, especially with young people?
It's a good question. I would say that the promoters all over the world are fighting for the interest of young generation, and everybody's complaining, but the same complaints. If you read the reviews from 20s and 30s, if you read the reviews from 50s and 60s and 70s, the reviewers are, and everybody's complaining the same way. And it makes me remember this famous story that what kind of a young generation we have. We were different, but it's not true. And in fact, I would say that the interest of young generation is not bad. There was special problem in our country because before 1989, some people have chosen musical career as a mean how to travel, how to realize their dream to be connected with the world. So it was, I would say, a bit false motivation. And there was a small crisis after 1990 because many musicians were somehow depressed by the fact that other professions are going ahead again, lawyers, scientists, and so on, doctors of medicine and so on. So there was a certain delusion among musicians because for many of them it was such a relative loss of the social position. But it has changed, and nowadays we have many young people who decide to study music because they love music and they don't expect to become rich and they don't expect to travel because they can travel.
Maria Shramkova-Levek. Mila is my teacher and Hannah, and in English I'm Mary Shramik-Levek. My question is, I have a picture in my mind of a very elderly cellist who is supposed to be guarded during some unrest by a soldier, and the young soldier falls asleep on the cellist's shoulder. And so now the cellist is guarding the soldier. So I have something wrong. I thought it was Rostropovich and the soldier was Soviet. Apparently that cannot be. Does anybody else have this picture and know the answer? No? I guess I'll look it up on the internet.
I'm sorry, I cannot help you.
Didn't Rostropovich have soldiers at his dacha and at Solzhenitsyn's dacha guarding them? You know, guarding him?
It's true that Rostropovich supported Solzhenitsyn. There was such a connection inside the Russian, let's say.
And there were soldiers, weren't they?
It's quite probable. It's quite probable.
Is there perhaps something in the among the members in the archives of the Czech Philharmonic who had to play during normalization under other conductors, and then they played under the greatest Czech conductor again in 1990? Did any member of the Philharmonic perhaps make a comment on it, that it was a different, not a different orchestra, but that they played differently, that the music became different? Is there something in the archives perhaps? But maybe I should correct my question, because musicians say they speak with tones and music and not with words. But I wondered whether somebody put this into words. Is it too convoluted a question?
No, I don't think so. I think that the change of the system had no impact on the way Czech Philharmonic played. The Czech Philharmonic had certain crisis that was a bit connected with what I was speaking about, a certain delusion. They thought that they will always be a superstar of a society, and members of many other orchestras had the same problem. But nowadays, they restarted their modern career that is based on other values, not just on the fact that they want to be different from the rest of the society. They now know that they are part of the society. The Ministry of Culture created a special plan for the Czech Philharmonic. They are better paid. They are they are expected to work more, and it seems to me that it starts to work, and this is now an example also for other orchestras, and maybe this is an example for other cultural institutions. It's a general problem of the society how to find financial sources for traditional musical institutions, how to pay musicians, how to pay people in the theaters. I have certain ideas how to make it, but there are sharp discussions about that. In Germany, the problem was solved by certain differentiation. Germany was not afraid to do big reorganization of musical life, and musical life of Germany is very rich. Germany is really maybe the strongest country as to the musical life. They have many excellent orchestras and opera houses, but they were courageous to make certain cuts. But those cuts were done very well. They put the efficiency of existence of those institutions on higher level, and it goes quite well. But we were not courageous to make such a cuts, and it's still in front of us, and it will come, because I have an example. There is an opera house in the city of Ústí nad Labem, what is close to the German border, and everybody from Ústí nad Labem can come to opera house to Prague or to Dresden. I would recommend to go to Dresden, by the way. It's very close. And there's a question whether we are rich enough to pay dying opera house in Ústí nad Labem. And it's challenging nowadays, because everybody can go to the cinema to follow direct transmission from Metropolitan Opera in New York and pay 100 crown for that, what is about $5. So if you can have an excellent high definition transmission from Metropolitan Opera and you pay $5 for that, there's no reason to go to the bad opera house next door. Sorry to be tough, but that's it.
May I still say something? You spoke about Ústí nad Labem. Well, in Vancouver, which is not the hub of the greatest, well, we have quite a good opera and quite a good symphony, but every year a group of students from the University of British Columbia goes to Ústí nad Labem and performs there, and they performed also Janáček, and the Czech apparently some. I live in Vancouver, so it's sort of first-hand information, but the Czechs in the audience came to those students and they started speaking Czech to them, and they could not answer because the only thing they knew was the text of Jenufa, which they played there, which they sang there. So that connects with another perhaps thought of the Czech language begins to grow through Janáček's operas. For example, in the language doesn't grow, the people grow who try to learn it. And in Victoria, BC, they played Jenufa last year, and the students, the Czech courses at the university grew because students came to learn Czech. I'll be quiet now.
It's true, because nowadays operas are performed worldwide in original languages, including Janáček, which is quite demanding for let's say Finnish soprano to speak Janáček's Czech, because even more because it's a special version of Czech, so it's quite demanding to learn Czech and to sing it, but they do it perfect way. I've heard Karita Mattila, famous Finnish singer, singing Czech, and she was perfect. It was unbelievable.
I think we have to take a break. I want to thank Roman Bělor for this beautiful talk, and I think we're ready for a break. We have to change gears. Thank you.
Thank you. Just one small thing to say. I have brought a copy of oldest Czech music encyclopedia for local library. It's a facsimile. It's a facsimile, and the original was edited in 1569.